Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Adil Sultan and welcome to the third segment of Strife Asia program on the ongoing Ukraine-Russian war. The prolonged conflict is leading to serious consequences for global economy, which is also leading to food shortages and energy shortages for the region and beyond. To understand the implication of the ongoing war, we have a panel of experts with us who will be discussing the economic impact, the food shortages, and the energy crisis in the immediate neighborhood and beyond, and for the global security. So I have with me Dr. Afsah Qazi. She is assistant professor at the Department of Strategic Studies at the Air University, and Ms. Aiza Azam. She is a lecturer at the Air University and Department of Strategic Studies. To begin with, Dr. Afsah Qazi, let's start. How is the ongoing war threatening energy and food security of Ukraine's neighbors and rest of the world?
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Adil Sultan, for inviting me on this panel. The war in Ukraine, of course, it has impacted the entire world. So, and since we are living in a globalized world where the entire economy and even world politics is interconnected, it's very difficult for any country in the world to remain to remain isolated from the impact of the war. And since the two countries involved in the war, they are Russia and Ukraine. So Ukraine, for quite a longer period of time of its history, has been known as the food basket of the former Soviet Union. And also in the World Trade Organization data for 2021, Ukraine's agricultural exports amounted to around $46.6 billion. So definitely, when there's a war going on where Ukraine, and secondly, Russia was known as is currently the world's energy basket. So one is world's food basket and one is world's energy basket. So if two of the countries which are providing for a majority of share of world's food and energy reservoirs are involved in a war, and since war has its own dynamics, war calls for protecting borders, imposing protectionism, imposing restrictions on free flow of trade, and plus, of course, as we go into the detail of this discussion, we see how internal and external pressures and sanctions are impacting both Russia and Ukraine. So therefore, the impact on world's food and energy supply, especially through the disruption of the global supply chain, that has been very significant.
Yeah, thank you. We'll come to food shortages and the energy shortages later, and we'll discuss in more detail. Let me go to Ms. Aiza. There had been crises in the past also, 2008 and 2014, but this crisis, the current crisis, which has prolonged and we don't see any end to it. How do you see the difference between the previous crises and the current one? Because the similar concerns were also there in 2008 and 2014 once Crimea happened. So how do you differentiate or analyze these two crises?
I think there are some similarities and there are also some differences between the current crisis and then the crisis in Georgia in 2008 and also with Crimea in 2014. So if we look at, for instance, in terms of where the political leadership and the public stand in both cases. So for example, with the current leadership, what we see specifically in Georgia, there's a divide between the Georgian political leadership and the Georgian people. So Georgia has actually been hesitant to take a very firm stance against Russia. Of course, there is pressure on it from its European allies, but it has been hesitant to explicitly come out and take a strong position against Russia, primarily because it does not want to be impacted in the same way. There is a rising difference between the Georgian people and the Georgian leadership, and the Georgian public has come out actively in support of the Ukrainian brethren. If we look at it in terms of, for instance, support from the European countries or from the rest of the world, or their response to the crisis, there's a stark difference between what happened in Georgia in 2008, how that was received by the world, and what has happened now. Also keeping in view the fact that the Georgian invasion by Russia was a very limited crisis. It lasted less than a week. And the current crisis is actually sort of a long stalemate. It's an ongoing crisis. Probably Russia had not configured that it would last this long as well, but it is ongoing. If you look at it in terms of, for instance, territorial acquisitions, or more specifically not territory, but what the objectives were. So the objectives were political in both cases. If you look at it in terms of the territory that was acquired. In Georgia, the breakaway provinces were acquired, or they were declared as accepted by Russia at the end of the war. So it was in conclusion. In this case, the two territories, or the breakaway, not the breakaway provinces, but those who had declared that they wanted to join Russia into NAXT, they had actually been annexed prior to the war, and in a sense they were a prelude to what would be coming further. So it was a sort of a prelude to an ongoing or a longer invasion.
So the world is more alarmed this time, and they have reasons for that. And this conflict has enlarged, especially the neighbors, Russian and the Ukrainian neighbors. They're more alarmed by these developments. What, in your view, are the major concerns? Why this significant alarm amongst Ukraine's neighbor that they could be potentially the next target of Russia? Is this the reason, or there are other reasons to that?
Carrying forward from what Ms. Aiza has said, why the crisis this time is different, I would start, my answer to this question also by relating to the previous one. So the crisis is different, and the concerns are more, the intensive this time, because the world has already, just gotten out of the COVID pandemic. And COVID has disrupted, the global, the entire globality as a phenomena that we see. The global economy, global politics, international organizations, they have all been challenged. The cooperative mechanisms that have existed in the in the post World War II world, they have all been challenged by the coming of COVID. And so, just as we look at the material ramifications of the war that is going on, the material ramifications are, the war has not erupted in a scenario or in a context that was normal. The context was already abnormal. So there is a war in an already abnormal context. So coming to the concerns of the neighbors of both Russia and Ukraine, the biggest concern, I think, is regarding the founding feature of the modern international order, which is the principle of state sovereignty, and which, the principle of state sovereignty, which the very Charter of United Nations, it protects. And the entire United Nations regime and the international legal system, it abides by the principle of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. So this is more concerning because in what happened in 2014 was that it was never a full-fledged war. Russia never declared a war in Ukraine in 2014. It said that we are protecting the Russian-speaking people in Crimea. So, and then they conducted a referendum, and they then annexed the territory of Crimea. This time what they have done, that they have under the tag of a special military operation, they have launched a full-fledged invasion against a neighbor state, which is a completely sovereign independent state. It is completely against the principles of UN Charter and international law, and this time the states, they face a dilemma. Basically the dilemma is it's a normativeness, or it's a normative versus the economic dilemma. Should they go with the economic significance that Russia has, and should they keep on engaging Russia the way they were engaging before the outbreak of war, or should they take a normative stance, or should they find a way in between where the principle of state sovereignty and UN Charter are also protected, while their economic concerns can also be protected? So this is a bigger dilemma.
Let's go to the specifics of energy crisis. Russia is one of the biggest supplier of gas and energy to the European countries. How do you see this conflict affecting the industries in Europe and beyond?
So the entire in the age of industrialization, since we have moved into the era of industrialization, the entire industry runs with the help of energy resources. So each and every aspect of an industrial sector, and we live in a world where there's a food industry, everything has been industrialized. The food has been industrialized, agriculture has been industrialized, clothing has been industrialized. So these are all industries now, because we have moved from the pre-industrial mode of production to the industrial mode of production, which requires the running of factories, and the factories and the the infrastructure of the industries requires free flow of energy reservoirs to run. So all the plants which are working in the factories, they require energy reservoirs to be run. So therefore, if energy now Russia is playing a very wise game, and a very sort of vicious game as well. It's playing wise in its own interest, but vicious in the interests of others. So while European Union imposed sanctions on Russian energy imports, so Russia took the lead in taking the decision into its hand that I would decide the timetable of when the European dependence on Russian energy resources would end. So therefore, it also started, lashing out its energy exports to the European Union. This further emboldened the crisis for the European Union and all the industries, and the primary industries that have been affected, even the agricultural industry is being affected, because the modern day agriculture, it works on the basis of it works on it works with the use of fertilizers. We use fertilizers for, there's an entire fertilizer industry.
We'll come to the food crisis because the fertilizer industry is affected by this lack of gas supply. So we will come to that. Let me move to Ms. Aiza also. Why I asked the comparison between the previous crises of 2008 and 2014 and now, there was a concern at that time also that the European Union or the other countries should reduce their dependence on Russian gas and energy supplies. But over a period of time, what we saw, because Russian gas is cheaper, and these countries, despite all these security concerns, they again increased their reliance. In fact, after the breakout of war, within a month, they were purchasing more gas from Russia, contrary to what the expectations were. So that's why I asked why the European countries, they didn't increase their own indigenous sources or renewable energy sources, and why they continue to bank on the Russian supplies, and what is the likely future, because this crisis has now grown extended to over 10 months period.
Absolutely, I agree. Europe certainly had a precedence for this kind of crisis. They have had to face similar behavior when oil or gas supplies were cut off, either directly to Ukraine or because they go through Ukraine as a transit. So this happened in 2006, it happened in 2008, 2009, and again in 2014. But despite that, what we saw was there was a very slow move towards, there was a lot of talk about moving towards renewable energy, but for various reasons. One, for example, renewable energies are more expensive to develop and to expand and to move towards. They did not want to go down the nuclear route. So now that is another option that is perhaps possibly coming back to the table.
Even the countries that had nuclear power plants, Germany,
Like Germany,
that was
absolutely.
closing down. And there is a now resurgence of that thought that they might need again
Absolutely.
back this.
Because moving into renewables is not going to be easy. It is going to take time, potentially 10, 20 to 30 years before they're fully able to move towards renewables. So now this is a crisis. And the reason that this is a problem is because Europe is Russia's, apart from the fact that they're Russia's biggest trading partner, in excess of $250 billion, billion euros. Russia provided oil and gas to most of Europe, just under 50% of natural gas to the European countries, a quarter of Europe's oil. So all of this has now effectively been disrupted. With Nord Stream alone, between Germany and Russia, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 5,000 million cubic meters of gas per month. So the fact is that initially at the outbreak of the conflict, earlier in this year, there was a flurry of condemnation for Russia. There was a move, there was public pressure, there was also pressure from their allies across the Atlantic that we need to move towards sanctions on Russia. But what we're seeing is that now reality is starting to seep in. And now that winter is coming in, it is significantly affecting the gas supplies and their energy supplies of the European countries. So for example, all of this pressure is now coming onto the common man. So for instance, we're now nearing Christmas, and traditionally they have a lot of these Christmas markets which remain open well past midnight in a lot of these European countries. Now they've started actively to close around 7 or 8 p.m. because they cannot afford to go beyond that. Lighting at their public monuments has decreased. And then this is just the public face. The individuals as well are facing a lot of this pressure in their home. So for the consumer, it's difficult. So I think what we're probably going to see is possibly within a few weeks' time, it depends on the willpower of not just the political leadership in Europe, but also the people, because there is a certain limit up to how much they would be willing to absorb. And we need to keep in mind also that, yes, energy is the primary aspect, but there are also other aspects which probably we'll touch upon later, like food security and with the refugee crisis. So all of that is going to have a collective impact, and pressure is going to increase to move towards a negotiated settlement with Russia.
Yeah, this politics of energy is going to play a significant role in the outcome of this conflict also. And there are concerns about environmental degradation also, because some of the countries, they are now turning back and opening up again the coal-powered plants. So again, those concerns, because there are serious concerns, and we saw that in recent COP also. How do you see the impact on a region like South Asia of this energy crisis? Because we are also dependent heavily on imported oil and gas. So bulk of the supply is going towards Europe. The cost is increasing, especially for developing countries like Pakistan. So what do you see the future of this?
When talking about the impacts of the energy crisis that has been ensuing since the war in Ukraine, and specifically its impacts on the countries of the global south. I would not take it as specifically dealing to the region of South Asia, but as the global south, but with reference to the global south as a whole. So the capitalist model, basically it has promised, development to global south if they follow the model of the global north, basically. And but the problem now is that if global north is immersed in its own problems, and it is hard for global north to deal with its own shortages and finding ways to remedy the shortages brought by the Ukraine war, then how is the global north going to prioritize the problems and the difficulties of the global south? So for countries of South Asian region or countries like Pakistan, which are already energy deprived, and we are already net importers of energy resources. So the disruption of the global supply chains is going to, it is going to be a problem for every country that is a net importer of energy resources. And the problem with South Asia is that Europe has an option to diversify, but probably South Asian poor economies, except for India, they do not have an option to as good an option to diversify energy resources as developed countries have. More importantly, Europe is looking towards American.
But sorry to cut you. Once we talk about South Asia, probably India is benefiting from this crisis.
Yes.
It is purchasing oil at a cheaper rate.
Yes.
Yes,
also we need to see, when we compare the case of India, or when we look towards Pakistan in comparison to India, that can we actually make the best out of the crisis, and can we also have more imports from Russia? Actually, we were engaged in a trade relationship with Russia, but in fact our relations with both, our trade with both Ukraine and Russia has been hampered since the war. Why? Because we are already under an IMF program, and once you are under an IMF program, you are basically following what is being decided in DC. So once Washington is having an entire sanctions campaign against Russia, and of course we can't really follow what we want to do.
Well, we will come back to the economic impact of this crisis. Let's just deal with this issue of gas shortages for countries like Pakistan and India. There has been talk, Ms. Aiza, about Pakistan, why Pakistan doesn't go to Russia. So I think there was more of politics involved in this between different regions. What are the prospects of Pakistan buying oil from Russia, whether it's feasible, whether Russia would be ready to sell that at the same price as it is selling to India?
I think it depends. A lot of it, like you mentioned, it comes back down to politics. So when we saw, for instance, at the beginning of the year, just prior to the outbreak of the conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan had visited Russia, and they were actually in talks with regards to cooperation on trade, on energy, on other matters as well, and basically building closer relations. And then, of course, the war broke out, and there was a suspension of, let's say, activity or cooperation going on in between, coupled with, of course, difficulties in the political realm at Pakistan's end also. But primarily the focus of this had been the North-South gas pipeline project, which has been in talks for years between Pakistan and Russia, but it has not yet materialized. What we saw was that at the beginning of this month, in the first week of December, the government of Pakistan announced that Russia had agreed to export crude oil to Pakistan and gasoline and diesel at significantly reduced prices. They also said that Russia was in the process of installing new production units for LNG, and that Pakistan had been invited to come to Russia and discuss this. But I think that it's important to also keep in mind that Russia has yet to comment on it and to actually sort of signify whether this deal is actually going to go through. So there needs to be probably a differentiation between whether this statement or this ray of hope that was thrown out was for domestic political consumption, or whether there is something that is going to actually materialize. But the fact remains that there is a lot of pressure on Pakistan as well with our energy shortage. So at some point, something would have to be done. And of course, you cannot discount the external political pressures on Pakistan, as there have been on other countries across the globe. So essentially, it is about choosing between whether to support Russia or not support Russia, support Ukraine, not support Ukraine, or remain neutral. And can any country really remain neutral in a crisis such as this?
I think that's important, because most of these statements that came from the Pakistani officials claiming that Russia has agreed, but we haven't heard anything from the Russian side, whether they are willing to, and whether we have that kind of money to buy on cash, because Russia won't be giving it free. Let's move towards the other major issue, that's the food crisis, the impending food crisis. It is already there. The cost, the prices, commodity prices are high globally and also in this region also. Ukraine was considered to be a food basket of the world. We have seen a deal where Turkey also played, and there was some ease. How do you see it is going to impact on global food prices, this ongoing crisis in this region, and its impact in the immediate neighborhood and globally in terms of food crisis?
Okay, so to comment on the food crisis, there are two things that we need to know. Is enough food not being produced, or is there a problem with distribution of food? So the important thing is that probably the food is being produced at a relatively lesser rate as compared to the pre-war situation. Ukraine, according to World Food Program, Ukraine was one of its key, actors in the global food supply chain. And Ukraine was also playing a very important role in exporting food to through the World Food Program to the communities which are at the verge of famine. But now the issue is that the Ukrainian farmers, since the outbreak of war, they have managed to sow a relatively lesser amount of the yield that has been produced. The agricultural yield has been relatively lesser, not much lesser. So the yield is there. The main problem occurs when it comes to the distribution of food and the food prices. Now, when it comes to the issue of food,
sorry to interrupt. Distribution, yes, for now, but as we progress in the coming months and years, because this crisis will have its long lasting impact, the shortage of fertilizers, hundreds of thousands people migrating, so less productivity also. So over the period of time, the impact of this crisis is going to have on the production also, not on distribution.
Yes, as well. So yes, in the longer run, not only distribution would be a problem, the food production would also get reduced. Why? Because the modern food industry also requires constant innovation. And just as you mentioned, the brain drain is occurring due to the people migrating from their hometowns and fleeing to other countries. So one problem with Ukraine is, for example, if the impact on food security due to Ukraine war is considered, so 70% of Ukraine's trade occurs via sea, and all the seaports, majority of the major seaports in Ukraine, they have been hindered due to, or they have either been bombed, or they have been choked due to the Russian presence. So the European Union and the World Food Program, under the framework of United Nations Trade and Development Program, they have found a way. They have in WTO there was they said that for the World Food Program, and the food which would be transferred to communities under that program, it would be tariff free. They would not face any barriers. As far as the food prices are concerned, as the fertilizers are needed for food production, so the problem is that the industries are run on the basis of, or with the help of, the energy resources. As energy supply is faces a shortfall, the fertilizer industry is going to face a shortfall, and the prices, since the raw materials are becoming expensive, the finished goods are becoming expensive.
So there is a correlation.
Yeah, there is
energy
a correlation.
Shortage of energy, it will affect all the industries, including the food industry also.
Yes.
Ms. Aiza, let's briefly analyze how it is going to impact countries like Pakistan. We at one time was self-sufficient, but now we have to import wheat and certain other commodities, and from Ukraine and Russia we were importing. So how it is going to affect Pakistan, where the food prices are already high and now the shortage is also coupled with that? How it is going to impact?
There's definitely going to be an impact. So for instance, if we look at our wheat imports from Ukraine, about nearly 40% of our wheat imports were actually coming in from Ukraine. And I believe in 2020, the year 2020, 2021, we actually imported about 2.1 megatons of wheat from Ukraine. So all of this has impacted. This is just the direct impact that is going to, in terms of our food security and food shortages. But we're also impacted by the indirect costs. So we're talking about, for example, when there's disruption in the global commodity supply chains, that's also going to impact us. And like my colleague Dr. Afsah mentioned, there's also been disruptions in terms of, for instance, the industry. So what we're actually seeing now is that in addition to the rest of the world, Pakistan is also going to have to face the brunt of this. And it is really going to, in a country that is already, we're beset with political instability, we're beset with political uncertainties, perhaps the more politically correct term. We're already facing an energy shortage, increasing supply rates. And I believe that, if I'm not mistaken, earlier today or late yesterday, it was announced that basics or staples like onions and tomatoes, which we use in our everyday cooking, and wheat, of course, is also a staple for us, prices are now equivalent to what the dollar rate is. So this is actually, if you think about it in terms of how this impacts the purchasing power of the middle class even, or the lower middle class, it is actually straining everyone's finances. There is no consequent, or there is no corresponding increase in, for instance, the salaried individuals and what they are making. So it's actually going to significantly impact, and potentially this could then lead to greater dissatisfaction with the current government. It might also even lead to more instability within. So we really need to figure out how we are going to navigate our way through this crisis, because it only looks like it will set to increase until such time as there is a negotiated settlement.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now let's move to the third important element that we want to discuss in today's segment is about economy. There's lots of talk about global recession. Is it really happening, Dr. Afsah?
The world just came out of the threat of recession when COVID ended, and in fact COVID has not completely ended as well. The cases are again rising in China and in a number of other parts of globe as well. So recession basically means a slowing down of economic activity. It's not, that the economy is going to come to a close, or the world economy will stop functioning. Basically, it means that the economic activity is going to be slowing down. So yes, we have already witnessed the slowing down of world economy during COVID, and while the world was trying to recover from the impacts of COVID-19, now we have been hit by this war. And how this war, why do we say that it impacts the entire global economy? We say that primarily, I think, if I try to build a linkage between what comes first and what comes second, and what then leads to a greater impact. So I think primarily it is the energy. Since energy runs the food industry and energy runs the global economy as well. We have a highly industrialized global economy run by high-tech industries and high-tech industrial outposts. So therefore, once the energy is not there, the global economy is going to get a hit. Now when we say, are we having a global recession? So basically the world economy grows by means of trade. Right, the revenue that is generated in the world economy, the primary engine for since the end of World War, I think, has been I guess has been trade, or freely flowing trade. So the important thing is the war. Not only there are some of the trade, some of the trade is being hindered by the war, while some of the trade is being hindered by the indirect impacts of the war, because the countries are becoming protectionist. Plus, also what contributes to recession is not only the war in Ukraine. There are two other factors that we need to keep in mind. One is the already recessionary impact of the COVID-19, where economies were going protectionist and they were trying to rebuild their economies. Second has been the devastating impacts of climate change, which have been becoming more intensified over the last few years. Every now and then, and many of the yields of the agricultural crops, they get impacted due to the climate change. So, and importantly, if a major economy, which is the largest economy by size, Russia, if it's going to get impacted, if there have been analysis which say that of course Russia has saved somehow till now. Russia has saved itself from the impact of Western sanctions, but in the longer run, this is not going to be the case. As the world's a country that is largest by in terms of land mass, when it's going to be impacted, and when its population is going to be economically impacted, which means that their standard of living is going to fall, then ultimately the world economy, and since Russia is a major source of world energy supplies, that is also going to get impacted.
Thank you. You mentioned about sanctions. Let me come to Ms. Aiza. How effective are these sanctions on Russia, and how it is affecting Russian economy, its neighbors, and the global economy?
I think when you talk about the impact of sanctions, you really have to look at what sanctions are targeting. So generally, as a whole speaking, sanctions are aimed at publics, or rather the impact of, there you can say that they're aimed at the political leadership, but the entire point is for the public to be squeezed of the target country, and whether or not that will create a reaction that will compel the political government to actually change its policies. So it depends on how the public is viewing this. If you look at, for instance, in Russia, there is a divide between the public. You have significant. We recall seeing that when the invasion actually happened, there were significant protests which had broken out in Russia in protesting the war, and that fact that Russia had actually entered into a conflict with another country. This is from Russians, and they were organic protests. And then we also see at the same time large sections of the Russian public which are actually supporting what their government is doing. So it really depends on how this is going to impact the Russian public. I think Russia is not facing any kind of energy shortage. Russia is not impacted in significant ways, particularly in terms of energy, and given the fact that it is a country where winters are quite extreme. So at least in terms of that sense, there is that pressure which is missing from the Russian public. Also, I think that if we look at it in terms of the impact, the alternative or the unintended impact that sanctions can have, what they can sometimes do is that if a country is squeezed, or if a political leadership of the target country is squeezed, and the public of that target country perceives that this conflict, for instance, that Russia has entered into, it has legitimacy, or that it is justified, as President Putin tried to justify it at the beginning of the war as well. So that actually has the opposite impact of rallying public support behind the political government. And what we have seen so far is that there has been outcry against what the political leadership has done, but there's nothing significant in terms of trying to reverse Russian policy at this particular point.
Great. Let me come back to Dr. Afsah. You mentioned three main factors which have affected and which are likely to affect the global economy, probably lead to recession also. The COVID, and then the climate change, and the third one is how do you see a country like Pakistan, which has been affected by this global climatic changes, and we saw the recent floods where the government claims that they had to suffer or bear the loss of over $30 billion. A country like Pakistan, with these three crises in a succession, how do you see the challenges for Pakistan?
The challenges indeed are grave, because and why they are further leveled up is because we are already under an economic distress. So whatever options we would be having on table to deal with climate change or food crisis or energy crisis or a war in Ukraine or siding with either side, all those options have been curtailed by our economic dependency on the West and the Western led organizations, international organizations. So and for instance, whatever we need to do for coming up with, so now there are two ways: either we simply go with the flow, as or either we innovate. There are two options: either to go with the flow, or because the pattern that we are currently following, it's a pattern of dependency. It's not going to bring us any more options. This dependency is going to further lead to even bigger dependency or more intensified dependency. So the only option is to innovate, and I think, but for innovation also you need to have certain leverage in running your economic affairs the way you want to run them. So and of course we keep on saying that we need to diversify our options, but diversifying the options is also not a very easy thing to do, because we are already, there's a web of linkages,
especially once there are global crises.
Once there are global crises, we are already in a web of complicated web of things, and we can't really disconnect ourselves from those things. So for countries like Pakistan, the food shortages, probably we need to look inward. We need to focus more on our indigenous produce of the food commodities, agricultural commodities. We need to curtail our dependence. We once were less dependent with regards to food, but now we have become more dependent over time. And more importantly, I guess that for dealing with climate change, we need to understand that climate change is not something that deals only with the climate. It affects your economy, it affects your military security, it affects your political and societal security as well. Because now all those people who have been affected by the floods, who are waiting to be rehabilitated, where are they going to go? What will be their new localities? Are they going to be placed in the same locales from where they came? Are we going to fund all of them to build their houses, to give them a way of sustaining their lives? Is the government capable of doing all these things? So the questions are bigger, but of course the strategies have to be innovative, and we somehow need to wean off from our dependence on the foreign monetary organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. There are no two ways. You have to be self-sufficient and independent in that. But let me, before I conclude, because we are running out of time, Ms. Aiza, how do you see these challenges for Pakistan? How to get out of these challenges?
I think it's going to be very, very important for the political leadership, and not just the political, not talking about the political party that's in power, generally the leadership of the country as a whole. They really need to be unified and decide on what direction it is that they need to take forward. So there cannot be internal political differences on this issue or even on any other issue at this point is not something that Pakistan can afford. Like my colleague rightly mentioned, we have just suffered from devastating floods, and the impact of that is not just limited to now. It is going to continue for several years as we learn to grapple with its consequences. We're also facing our energy shortage, our energy crisis, and we're already in a region which is not really known for its political stability. So we really need to be on the same page in terms of how we need to design our policies moving forward. And again, not being forced to move to one camp as opposed to the other camp. You really need to diversify policies and adopt or pick a line where we are not forced to choose between one partner or one region or another partner or another region, because we cannot actually afford to do that and then be dragged into somebody else's conflict with full regards, of course, with sympathies for the terrible consequences of the ongoing conflict. That is not to be disputed. But can Pakistan really afford to do that at this point? Can we not adopt a more neutral line like other countries have done? And we need to decide if that is affordable and whether we can actually push that through.
Exactly. Yeah.
I would just like to add one thing, just as Ms. Aiza rightly pointed, that political leadership has a role to play. One thing that can help amid all this, chaos where we have climate change crisis and we have food shortages, energy crisis and everything. I think one thing that really helps is the foreign direct investment by the multinationals or the international business firms. But now, why we do not have enough FDI is something that has more a political logic, and that is because the FDIs, the foreign direct the people who are the investors, they do not feel secure to invest in this environment, in this national environment or in this business environment. So making this environment useful for the foreign firms to come and function here and to have their franchises here is something that we have to assure. It's not, that is at least not something where the foreign countries or the IMF stops us from doing certain things. At least having a safe investment environment where the people who are residing inside Pakistan are secure. Just when I was reading the literature on impacts of sanctions on Russia, I came across a very significant new term, that was primitivization. One is privatization, so derived from that there was primitivization, which was which referred to the context that Russia is not having a very direct impact of the Western sanctions, but the Western companies are leaving Russia. So in the longer run, Russia would be technologically dependent, and it would have to indigenize, or it would have to look inward, or either it would be looking towards China or India. So the analysis was saying that looking towards a less developed and less advanced, technologically less advanced country, it would actually entail a certain cost rather than enhancing the profit. It would not only lead to the going out of the Western technology and Russia's lagging behind in terms of technology advancement. Rather, it would lead to a primitivization of industry. It would probably take Russia back to from where it started and the point from where it wanted to make itself different and be a modern world economy. So that is very significant.
Thank you very much for bringing out that. If country is unstable, there are no governance structure or the poor governance structure, definitely the foreign investors would be reluctant to invest in that country. And as Dr. Afsah also said, in fact, the already companies that are there, they would want to get out of that. So that's more of a governance and how do you do institutional reforms. But for a country like Pakistan, I think the challenges are many, especially once we see that we have not yet recovered from the COVID-19 crisis, although at that time government did manage it very effectively, but the impact of this crisis is still looming and we continue to suffer. And then we saw Ukraine and Russian war. It has also impacted the region and beyond, and then the climate effects. So these are multiple challenges that makes it difficult for a country like Pakistan to make choices. Thank you very much for taking time out and sharing your views on these important issues. And Ms. Aiza, thank you very much, and thank you. Thank you very much for watching this program.